Well, thank you for coming to the Bronfenbrenner Center to our Talk at 12 series. This is the last one for the semester. We'll have more next semester, maybe in a different room than this one. But thanks for coming. I think Tom must have invited all his family and friends here. It may be just a tribute to how popular he was on campus and in the community that he's packed the room. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on biographical details and take time away from Tom, but just to say, Tom was, as many of you know, is a graduate student recently at Cornell in education, got his PhD here in adult education, and worked as well in CORE, the Cornell Office of Research Evaluation, with those folks doing work on evaluation, building evaluation capacity, evaluation systems, and so forth. But for his dissertation, which he's going to talk about today, we actually had the privilege of being one of the, quote, subjects of his dissertation for his qualitative work that he's going to talk about today around evidence, this whole notion of evidence-based practice, translational research, from a kind of unique perspective, looking kind of really drilling down in terms of what that means, and using some of two of our programs as kind of exemplars or examples, case studies of that process. Tom has recently left Ithaca for a job as an assistant professor at Virginia Tech, so he's an assistant professor there. So now we have to call him Professor Archibald, I guess. So congratulations on that, and it's great to have Tom back with us to talk about it. We've been anxiously waiting to hear about his take on our operation and also the work in Africa that he's been doing. So I'm going to turn over to Tom and let him get started. Thank you for coming.
So thank you all for coming out and taking time out of your busy days. And thank you for all of you who've inspired me to do this type of work over the years. And my biggest goal today is to say something that is at least remotely useful or interesting to you. And I have way too much prepared, so I'm going to skip through some part quickly, because I do want to leave ample time at the end to discuss. Because actually, as Nigel was just saying, this is a great group of very creative minds all in one place. And it would be great if we have an opportunity to talk about some of these issues, some of these ideas. So, here at the center, one of the things that they do is research on translation. And in a sense, that's what my dissertation was. I was looking at various efforts to make non-formal or community-based education better connected to evidence or to research. And as John said, it was a qualitative study. And from the very beginning, it's quite obvious that education should be based on evidence. That's almost a cliche or kind of a platitude. But so one of the programs I looked at was an adolescent sexual health program in Kenya, and I found that they were actually influenced by this UN AIDS document called the Preferred Terminology Guidelines that had discourse about sort of how you should refer to program participants. And one thing they had, this was really interesting. They said instead of talking about evidence-based, you should talk about evidence-informed, because often there are several elements that play a role in decision-making, only one of which may be scientific evidence. So for me, this is a great example of the fact that what constitutes evidence is not actually self-evident. So is something evidence-based or evidence-informed? What does that mean? This has been a huge debate in the field of evaluation, which is kind of my home academic field. This book, which is I think 2009, was kind of a debate between people who really focus on randomized controlled experiments as being the criteria for good evidence versus other non-experimental designs. There's actually even a lobbying agency for one particular type of evidence. That's the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. That's very active in promoting particular research methodologies, which is really interesting to think that there's a lobby for a methodology. And the Campbell collaboration I'll come back to is one of these many clearinghouses that accumulates educational initiatives, curricula, things like that have been proven to be effective based on a randomized controlled trial, and they kind of put those out there as being evidence-based programs. Now, I've referred a couple times to a randomized controlled trial. If you're not familiar with that term, it's essentially a research methodology that for many, many years now has been called the gold standard. So ostensibly the best strongest form of evidence that you can have for trying to prove something. To show sort of how ubiquitous the evidence-based world is, here, even housed at the BCTR, there's a blog called Evidence-Based Living. So, we all base our lives on evidence, but this blog is trying to, review the scientific evidence and say, okay, what does the evidence say about this? And one aspect of the blog is to help people separate the good science from the bad science, or the good information from the bad information. So we'll come back to that as we go through. And Carl Pillemer, writing on the blog, actually sort of puts forward this gold standard notion about randomized controlled designs, where he sort of poses it as knowledge can only progress through an experiment where, through the experiment you have one knowledge sort of knocking out the other knowledge. So as we go through, I just want to keep this in mind and see how this pertains to how we think about community education. This work really started in medicine. It was really big evidence-based medicine, going back to the 90s. And it's really interesting because actually this caused a lot of stir, but basically evidence-based medicine ended up being defined as using the current best evidence, which could include studies from randomized trials, but also clinical expertise, so what doctors know about working with their patients. And one of the founders of evidence-based medicine came out specifically and said it is not restricted to randomized trials and meta-analyses, which is this way of sort of lumping together numerous randomized trials, but it's about tracking down the best external evidence when you're working with a patient. In spite of them sort of having this broader definition of evidence-based medicine, some people responded very vehemently, seeing it as a needless neologism, an act of intellectual poverty, a governmental management strategy to cut healthcare costs, and a scientific oversimplification of professional practice. And someone went even further to call it a good example of microfascism at play in contemporary scientific arenas. So from evidence-based medicine, we ended up at evidence-based education, which is of more interest to me. There was a report in, I think, 2002, where the National Resource Council basically defined what constituted science for educational research. And for them, they admit other types of methodologies, but they maintain the sort of gold standard notion of randomized trials being the best way to know about education. There were, of course, responses to this as well, people seeing it as evidence-based social engineering, and people misunderstanding science as being uniquely positivism and methodology as uniquely quantitative. So in a sense, this is getting back to the older debates about qualitative and quantitative ways of knowing about the world. There's a number of other reports. This report in the middle was actually very influential in the field of evaluation, because the American Evaluation Association, once this report came out asking for public comment about, basically the government was saying these methodologies are better than these, and the American Evaluation Association wrote a statement saying that was incorrect, that they should not be, the government should not be doing that. And some influential members of the association actually left and created their own association where randomized trials were seen as the gold standard. Interestingly, Michael Scriven, who's often seen as kind of the founder of the field of evaluation, in 2008 quite clearly stated that the randomized controlled trial has essentially zero practical application to the field of human affairs. And he has a whole article sort of explaining why. Now, I've been trained to see that randomized controlled trials can be useful in some cases, but they're not always useful. He goes on to kind of put together an argument sort of looking at how people in charge of RCTs have become sort of an esoteric cabal and who have a privileged position as the keepers of knowledge in society. And he says the real gold standard should be what it's always been in science, which is critical observation. A number of people who, in evaluation, would say the real gold standard is methodological appropriateness. So the methods you use should fit whatever the context is, that you can't just decide on methods out of hand. So one really clever way of thinking about the evidence-based movement was this article in the British Medical Journal called, with tongue-in-cheek, called Parachute Used to Prevent Death and Major Trauma Related to Gravitational Challenge, Systematic Review of Randomized Controlled Trials. Point being, you don't need a randomized trial to know whether parachutes help you not hit the ground so hard. So then one of my mentors, Bill Trosham, has actually posed this debate about the gold standard as one of the most important controversies in contemporary evaluation in applied social sciences. It's at the heart of how we go about trying to understand the world around us, and that there is a lot at stake. And Michael Scriven went on to say, there's a lot at stake, not just people with academic egos like me, but that this has to do with the welfare of a very, very many people. And that's why I chose this as a topic to look at, because as a community educator, I was concerned with how this was affecting the welfare of people in the community. So that's why I focused my study this way. My goal was to basically better understand what actually happens in these initiatives when people are trying to make education more evidence-based. What does that actually look like? I wanted to study the politics of evidence in practice. And you might say, well, what does that mean? What's the politics of evidence in practice? Well, there are pros and cons, like I've already showed you. There are some people who are very for it, some people who are very polemically opposed to it. And then also there are some technical solutions to this. For instance, Abe Wandersman, who many of you know, he does great work, for instance, on helping people implement evidence-based programs better, so these programs that are based on randomized controlled trials. And that's very, very important. And that's one way to address these questions. Then there are other people who call it microfascism and very, very sort of uniquely theoretical. Well, there was a study of evidence-based medicine that took a different approach, kind of a middle ground. And for them, instead of getting stuck on a sort of theoretical, polemical perspective, they wanted to open up the hood and look at what's actually going on. So they did a study of evidence-based medicine. It's in this book. And they wanted to see sort of, people agree that there's something happening, but instead of getting stuck on this rhetorical analysis, they wanted to see what was really going on. What difference did it make when you approach education, well, in their case, medicine, but in my case, education, this way? And at the end of the day, I want to help those of us who do education, be better able to do this. So my questions were essentially, how is evidence-based program and evidence-based practice work actually done? What does it look like? What perspectives and assumptions are manifest through that work? And what conflicts and tensions emerge through the work related to those diverse perspectives and assumptions? And as John mentioned, I looked at 3 different cases, 2 of which are housed right here in this building. One is Acts for Youth, which for many, many years worked across the state of New York as really a leader in bringing together coalitions of community folks who are focused on positive youth development, youth participation, and adolescent sexual health, but a number of other variables as well. Now, starting just around 2010, their major funder went through a very drastic shift in what they wanted to fund. So instead of these broad-based coalitions focused on supporting positive youth development, they started focusing uniquely on supporting what they call providers, who are community-based educators. Some are Planned Parenthood, some are community centers, who have to choose, and I say have to, choose from a list of 28 curricula or programs that then they're funded to implement. And the difficult task that Act for Youth is tasked with is to support that process. And it's very difficult. They do amazing work chasing down evaluation packets. They're basically the intermediary between the New York State Department of Health and these 58 community-based agencies out in the community. Then the second group is 4-H, where I used to work with 4-H Rural Youth Services here in this county. And 4-H, many of them are here. 4-H has been doing youth development for now 100 years, really focusing, ever since the term positive youth development was invented, 4-H, at least in Tompkins County, has been doing positive youth development. But now, especially in the last few years, there was a few changes. One was that 4-H became part of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research. So it's really interesting to think through, what does that look like? So 4-H has always been, like all of Extension, about the sort of bridge between science and communities. So what does that look like in the context of 4-H? And then the third was an adolescent sexual health program in Kenya, very similar to Acts for Youth, actually, except in obviously a different cultural context. And so in their case, it was a partnership between a U.S. university and this faith-based group in Kenya, and for years they had been developing a curriculum that was evidence-based in the sense that it was based on theory, actually Kirby's theories, but it had not had rigorous evaluation done of it. And so just recently, around the same time that the focus shifted for Act for Youth, their funder, who is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, started saying, okay, from now on, if you're not doing an evidence-based program, you get cut. So they've been scrambling to ramp up the evidence base for their, what they call a homegrown curriculum. Because another thing the CDC has been very active with is taking US-based programs and adapting them to Kenya. And so it's really interesting to think about what does that entail? What does it take? So that was something I was able to get some perspective on during my study. So basically, it was a qualitative study inspired by these two approaches to research called institutional ethnography and a sort of general constellation of approaches that tend to be used in science and technology studies. And we can talk more about that if we have time. But basically, I did 30 interviews with many, including people who are in the room. I did a lot of observation, including participant observation, because these were contexts that I was involved in anyways, and then all of a sudden I was doing research in them. And I also looked at a bunch of documents. And to analyze the data, I had some codes or themes that were already kind of preloaded based on my research questions and my interests, and I also let other ideas sort of pop out as I looked through the data. So one thing I was able to observe, sort of my findings, if you will, I learned a lot about what this work is. What does it take to work with evidence-based programs and evidence-based practices? And I'm going to get back to the distinction, why I have to say both of those terms each time. And I still don't know as much about it as many of you in the room, so I'm very limited, both in my time to talk about it and in my knowledge. But for instance, I found a lot of artifacts, and I learned about a lot of processes. This is the tool that the Kenyan government put together to help all of the people across the country of Kenya who are doing adolescent sexual health kind of have a rubric to go through and see whether or not they were evidence-based. So this had come out during the time of my study, and so my friends who were running this program, they were trying to check off all the boxes, and they actually ended up doing a randomized study at the school level, because their intervention actually happens in the schools as kind of like an after-school activity. And they were able to do that, and they had one person in the Kenyan office who was getting thousands and thousands of paper surveys back from this randomized study and trying to deal with that. So I saw that happening as one sort of difficulty. This is the report from Mathematica, which is a kind of research consulting firm, which along with another group called Child Trends, were the ones who came up with this list of 28 evidence-based programs that essentially Acts for Youth providers can choose from. And it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's, it's a list of 28 studies for which there was adequate evidence from well-done randomized controlled trials that made these gave the stamp of evidence to these particular 28 programs. Adaptation is a huge issue. There's a lot of great work going on in this center around adaptation. And one of the biggest, this is a picture of education right here. It's education in a box, literally. And I'll never forget, when I was sitting in on some stuff going on here, when someone at the center who had done adolescent sexual health before realized sort of that what it had become, where now the providers were expected to open the box and do the program, and one of the hard roles of Act for Youth is to try to reduce unapproved adaptation. And this person said, I wouldn't want to go into adolescent sexual health if all I got to do was read from a script. Where is the expertise? Where is the creative control of a trained educator? And this represents Act for Youth is constantly, they have implementation checklists, which is a huge thing in evaluation. They have evaluation packets they have to get in and summarize and send to the Department of Health. So it's very, very difficult work. One other thing I noticed is most of the providers have a really great relationship with Act for Youth, because Act for Youth also provides training and technical assistance, and many of them feel kind of alienated from the Department of Health, but Act for Youth is their go-to place when they need help. But then also these days, Act for Youth is working especially with the providers who are not doing so well, who are maybe, and I have actually a quote, I think, about adaptation, because it's I didn't put it in here, but basically, they have these checklists, and the people are supposed to send back, yes, I ran the program as planned. I stuck to the curriculum. We had 100% attendance. the whole time. And then they say, as they're leaving, they say, oh, by the way, we actually, we were running it in a school, and the periods were 45 minutes, so we cut off the last few activities every time. Well, the principle of a science-based program, that's not quite implementation fidelity. So this is going on all the time. So I have hundreds of stories like that. I also got to see, just outside of the whole evidence-based program world, just how difficult it is to connect research and practice. There's a lot going on with that here. 4-H actually has 3 dedicated people working with each of the mission mandates, and that's one of their roles. And so it's just really difficult to connect these two. We have a large amount of work going on around engagement and outreach, and how do we connect research with practice? So there's a lot behind that as well. So one of the things that jumped out at me the most was that essentially what was happening was different folks who I talked to and who I observed were essentially working off of fundamentally different perceptions about what community education is. So whether it was epistemologically, sort of their view of knowledge, or even ontologically, their view of the reality of the situation. And I have glossed these, kind of classed them into 2 separate modes, Mode 1 and Mode 2. But I want to say that many people, I myself, I work out of both of them at different moments. It's not a dichotomy, and one is not normatively better than the other. To be clear about my biases, I tend to fall more into Mode 2, but I am not against Mode 1. I just want to class this as in the interviews and the documents I looked at, these tended to come out as 2 different ways of sort of seeing the endeavor. So the first sort of variable is what non-formal education is. For some folks, it's essentially an infrastructure for the dissemination of science-based knowledge. But for other people, especially people associated with cooperative extension, it's a site for grassroots knowledge sharing. And those 2 are fundamentally different. And where the locus of decision-making around program planning and evaluation, in Mode 1, it tends to be campus-based or science-based, whereas in Mode 2, it's community-driven. Again, pretty fundamentally different. This is very important. This is why I have to keep saying evidence-based programs and evidence-based practices. Because as you see with Act for Youth, sure, there are practices involved, what the educator does, how they interact with the youth, and actually some folks here are looking at what are the characteristics of organizations where the EBPs are implemented well. What's different about them? Because there are different practices going on there. But fundamentally, they're working in terms of the program, right? The program has become completely hegemonic. Whereas in a lot of other community education work, especially 4-H, they tend to focus more on practices. And you can think in terms of evidence-based practices, like working to support belonging and mastery and generosity and independence. There are studies supporting those factors, but they're not a tightly scripted curriculum. They're approaches that an educator can use in a given context. This is important, too, how we think of behavior change. And I have some great quotes from actually someone associated with the Department of Health who said, I have a healthy skepticism about behavior change to begin with, and behavior change among young people and the actual ultimate effectiveness of a curriculum that's going to change behavior, such as basic behavior as sexual activity. I know there are examples of smoking cessation and maybe less alcohol use, but I really have an issue, and I think you experienced it with obesity some, and basic human activities that aren't really conducive to long-term behavior change based on some intervention provided for 4 or 6 weeks. So here's someone involved in the whole administration of this. The theory of change for an EBP is that if you sit through these 6 sessions and they're implemented with fidelity, then research has proven there will be some change that comes about. And it's efficacious, but it reduces some of the complexity involved in real life. Folks, other educators, both here at the center and also out in the community, they are wary to say, yes, I know this will prove this, So I had people say, I hesitate to say, if you do this, then this will happen, because life is a lot messier than that. So behavior change is more complex, nonlinear, and dynamic. Then the focus is different, too. With an evidence-based program, there are particular quantitative variables that you expect to see changes in. With, say, a 4-H program or Acts for Youth before 2010, it was more holistic, broad-based changes at a community level, not some operationally defined variable like is the case with the EBP approach. And this led me to wonder, are some content areas or some phenomena in the world just naturally better suited for having an RCT done of them and being put into an EBP? I even talked with some folks at the center who have worked on a few different initiatives, and they say, well, yes, we can do adolescent sexual health this way, but a different type of approach, a different behavior, that doesn't fit in. And a number of people in 4-H don't think, like, there are no evidence-based programs, really, for 4-H, because that's not the sort of unit that you work with. So if all of a sudden 4-H can only do evidence-based programs, which I will say, when people started thinking about how to make 4-H more translational, at first blush, it was going to be 4-H must implement evidence-based programs. Well, we'd be in trouble because no researcher has gotten the multi-million-dollar grant. There are a few out there. There's the Prosper model. There's a few others. But generally, that's not what's been going on. 4-H is much less like the medical model than, say, adolescent sexual health is, where you're looking at specific criteria. And at the AEA conference this year, Tom Cook was actually there, who, along with Campbell and Shadish, are sort of the gurus of randomized design and quasi-experimental designs. And Tom Cook's been doing a lot of work comparing the results of quasi-experimental designs, doing intra-study comparisons to see if you can get the same sort of strength of claim. And you can, so you don't always have to do a randomized trial. You can do a quasi-experimental design. But then he said one of the limitations is that if there's some phenomenon out there where there's never been a randomized trial done, then you can't do a quasi-experimental trial and compare the results. And so I went up after and said, well, so what do you do then? And he said, well, you could kind of lower the criteria of evidence and do a different type of study and then compare it there, or you can just sort of go on the best available evidence. So there's a little bit of questioning there. And so I'm wondering, is there something fundamentally different about, say, positive youth development versus adolescent sexual health, where one is more amenable to being put into an EBP and one is not? I don't know. There's a lot of conflicts around adaptation. And so another question that I wonder about is, say you're taking and there's some folks in the room, for instance, Emily Chen, who's done a lot of work on the science of adaptation. And it's really great work, and it leaves me wondering, sort of, how do we know what aspects of the program need to be adapted and which can be the same? So say there's an underlying theory of, like, self-efficacy. So obviously we know we have to put it into the language of the people who are going to be participating. We have to change the anecdotes and the videos and the stories so it fits their cultural context. But are the same underlying sort of theories of how humans are in the world, do those hold true? I don't know. In the Kenyan context, the CDC talked about Kenyanizing the curriculum. And, what does that even mean? And the CDC administrator said she would go observe some sessions that were supposedly Kenyanized, but they were still using kind of the curriculum still contained the sort of mannerisms and ways of speaking from Baltimore, where the curriculum was developed. And Kenya is also a very religious country, both Catholic and Muslim, and they ran into some really hot water. They had one EBP that they adapted into two streams, one for high school youth and one for elementary school youth, and the implementers mistakenly went into a Catholic primary school and started talking about condoms. They're lucky if they can ever go into that community again. And that was just like a little messy error, but it goes to show that that problem would not have happened with the homegrown curricula because they were working from the very beginning with people who understand. And not only that, the homegrown curriculum is also adapted. They have biblical verses in there. They have replaced them with Quranic verses for use over on the coast where the majority of the population is Muslim. One other quick little story about the science of adaptation. So, if you're thinking about an educational program as kind of an intervention or a dosage, right, you have to scientifically know how much of that dose someone is getting. So for a long time, Act for Youth wanted to know, okay, we know the kids aren't coming to the program 100% of the time. By the way, in the studies that proved these programs to be effective, in many cases, the kids were paid to come. But these community educators can't pay people to come to their programs. So, of course, attendance is bad, it's going in a school, the special needs kids get pulled out for special classes, so they're not getting the program. At the end of the day, can you say they experienced that program or not? So actually it's pushed and pushed and pushed. Finally, the Department of Health said 75% attendance is sufficient. And as far as we can tell, that was pretty much just pulled out of the air. So if this is going to be science-based, we have to rethink what is science. One of the biggest things is that, Acts for Youth spends a lot of effort trying to learn from and reduce the unapproved adaptations that go on out there. So we know, because some educators will do the craziest stuff, and that will not be helpful to the youth who are in the programs. However, there are some educators, for instance, one person who works with gangs, who knows that these videos from the 90s are not going to capture the attention of his gang members. So he would, this is like James C. Scott Weapons of the Week, where people are adapting, working in between the cracks to get done what needs to be get done. However, there was one program on the list of these 28 programs. The initiative, I didn't say, is called the Comprehensive Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program. Turned out one of the approved programs that was actually quite popular didn't talk at all about pregnancy prevention, but it was evidence-based. But it actually focused on HIV, STD prevention, which is very important. But it begs the question, should this really be an EBP as part of the CAP initiative? So it was sent back to the developers, who are usually university-based researchers, who kind of did the study. And then there's a whole industry, actually. The same guy who was sort of questioning the behavior change theory referred to this as an industry, because the developers develop the curriculum, and then they send it to a purveyor, which is essentially a publishing company that puts it into a box. So when they realized, oh, this one doesn't talk about pregnancy, they sent it back. The developers tacked on a unit on pregnancy prevention and sent it back out. Well, first the providers were saying, well, we can't fit this into the hour now that we had scheduled, because there's a whole other unit, or into the 6 weeks. And then they also said, how come they can adapt the program, but we can't? Right? And as far as we can tell, I haven't been able to track this down, but it was evidence-based because it went through a randomized controlled trial. But once it was fundamentally changed by adding, say, a 7th unit, it did not go through another randomized controlled trial, because that takes years and, perhaps $1 million. I had already mentioned how important it is to Kenyanize carefully and what that even means. So I want to end in just a couple minutes, but I actually have like 20 more slides. Really kind of crazy theoretical perspectives that, for me, help me try to reflect on some of these dissonances and these tensions that I saw coming through the study. And, like I said, my biggest goal with the study was to help, without having delusions of grandeur, but to somehow help out with the situation and try to make these educational contexts be more efficacious and also more ethical. So for me, instead of saying, okay, here's the checklist of sort of what we can do to implement things better, I turned to a few theories from different fields, from science and technology studies, for instance, that for me are very practical because they help us think through these difficult challenges. One, and basically they all have to do with the relationship between science, expertise, and democracy, kind of little d democracy, sort of how we all interact as a society and how we make decisions that affect our lives. And so one, we need to, as researchers, it's important to look at how certain forms of knowledge, such as that produced through a randomized trial and put into an evidence-based program, how they gain some sort of legitimacy and appear to be part of just life. There was an interesting study done a number of years ago of this controversy between Hobbes and Boyle around experimentation in an air pump. And Boyle was saying, this is the true path to knowledge about the world. And Hobbes, who was more metaphysical, was saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. And the study is actually looking at the discursive formation. How of course, there's a different type of experimentation, but there's a clear parallel there. How one type of knowledge was made to be more real or more, what counts as proper scientific knowledge. That's what we've been talking about the whole past hour. And how truth and adequacy and objectivity get made, that those aren't self-evident, but those are things we need to look at and sort of think about. And that instead of starting with these pre-established truths or norms, like this is true knowledge about the world, we need to look at how those truths and norms are made as a process and a set of practices themselves, which could be objects of inquiry for us as researchers. Then this is really Sheila Jasanoff, who very interestingly contributed to this report that got a lot of traction at this year's American Evaluation Association conference. Again, dealing with these difficult issues of how do we connect, we have all this great research, but the policymakers aren't using it. Okay, we're having some problems there. So she was actually on the board of this, and she is a science and technology studies scholar, and she talks about the problem of treating some knowledge as political and some as scientific is an issue because the very contours of what is certain or uncertain in a given policy question, such as how do we keep young people from getting pregnant, those contours get established through practices, through negotiations. And she says that scientific knowledge, well, actually, no, this is Leach, Schoons, and Wynn, who do a lot of work in international development, but that scientific knowledge deployed in public arenas is actually shaping human relations and shaping imagined communities and ontologies, sort of the way reality is. And it's kind of making some realities to be more real than others. And Moll and Berg agree. They say there are tensions among shaping practices, say educational practice, in one way, which make the world run in this way versus this way. What programs get funded, which get cut, which are based on evidence, which aren't. It matters. And it's basically the provision, it's the performance. We're making different realities more real or less real through our work with evidence. And then this is just real quick to mention that science is very important, but if we say that everything should be science-based, kind of unreflexively, we forget that the sphere of knowledge is actually wider than the sphere of science. And science, by the way, is wider than randomized experiments. Fluberg is well known among some of us, at least, in sort of recuperating Aristotle's notions of different types of knowledge. There's episteme, which is what an evidence-based program can sort of deliver. There's techne, which is the craft or art, which a lot of educators are involved with. And then there's phronesis, which has to do with values. And Gerrit Bieste, who talks a lot about value-based education instead of evidence-based education, also talks about how there's a lot of epistemological, ontological, and praxeological assumptions built into this. Just really quickly, epistemologically speaking, evidence-based programs based on randomized controlled trials work off of a representational epistemology where knowledge of the world is seen as kind of a mirror of it, when really a lot of research for, hundreds of years has suggested more of a kind of transactional epistemology. Heisenberg, not the character from Breaking Bad, but the original Heisenberg, was quoted as saying, what we observe is not reality, but reality subjected to our mode of questioning, right? So it depends what you ask. And then another notion that's become very important to me is the notion of epistemic justice. And in a nutshell, it's just looks at the processes and the abstract hierarchies that make some ways of knowing about the world more valued than others. So for me, thinking about community education and evidence, this is an important theoretical perspective that can practically help us in our day-to-day work. So finally, this is Donald Campbell, who was one of Bill Troshin's mentors, and whose name is lent to the Campbell collaboration. And I think that if he were alive today, he would try to shut the Campbell collaboration down, because he said in 1984 that definitional operationalism, which is essentially kind of misconstruing a measure of something for the actual thing, so like to think IQ is intelligence, when really we know it's a close approximation of intelligence. And essentially doing an evidence-based program based on a randomized controlled trial on one or two variables is kind of like definitional operationalism. He called it an unmitigated disaster that came out of logical positivism. Few people actually ascribe to logical positivism anymore if they're pushed on it. Positivism still exists, but he says it persists most perniciously in social policy science, the accountability movement. That was 1984. The accountability movement is much more alive today than it was in 1984. And managerial control efforts employing single explicit quantitative criteria. But it's not all doom and gloom. He actually had some suggestions. So he said, instead, say you have a new initiative, maybe a new way of working with youth development or adolescent sexual health. Well, instead of having one research consulting firm come up with the list of acceptable programs, you should actually, so later in his life, Campbell talked about evolutionary epistemology that most people don't know about, but he was talking about basically how ideas follow an evolutionary trend, just like biological organisms. So in order to foster that, to sort of resist a monoculture of ideas and of educational approaches, we should allow every state, every community to try what they're doing. And if it's working, they should do a little bit more evaluation on it. And then if it's really working, they should share it with others. And that's the way knowledge and professional practice can actually proceed. So lastly, basically what I found, or what I think at least, is there are other validities other than just internal validity, which is sort of what the randomized control trial is so valuable because it's the best way to talk about internal validity. But Cronbach always talked about external validity, and Huey Chen more recently has been talking about viable validity, which is like, sure, it worked in that trial, but is it going to work at all in any of our community contexts? That's a different type of validity, which matters. One of my study participants talked about, who does a lot of randomized studies, talked very eloquently about how randomization has a mystique and also an instrumentality. I'm not against randomized studies, but we have to notice when it's the mystique working and when it's the actual instrumentality of that methodology. You know, I would suggest we foster more methodological and epistemological plurality so that we can try to do this work even better. So thank you. And we do have time for
Archibald is to make available the PowerPoint because this is here and it's a little bit spacey.
You should have put a mirror over there. Yeah, I think it's actually being recorded too, so it'll probably be on the BCTR website, right, John? Possibly. Okay. Yes, and sorry that you couldn't see it from there. I mostly read from my slides, which you're not supposed to do, but you got most of it that way. So, what do you think? Yes, Jane.
So, first of all, as being one of the subjects, it's really cool.
Are you still my friend?
I am. So I just want to set the record straight, okay, about one thing that I don't want people to leave. First of all, the health department's been very generous in supporting Active Center of Excellence for like 13 years, very generously. And there's some very, very progressive thinkers there and who are doing great work for us in New York State. We're really lucky. The whole requirements are not coming from the health department. They're federal mandates.
That's right.
Okay. So let me just point out, especially when you mention that 75% attendance is a huge issue for us, all right, in getting, you know, the EVPs were tested with pretty much 100% attendance to get those outcomes, and we're nowhere near that. But that 75% marker came from the Fed, okay? That did not come from New York State. And so that's just so people know that it's not just randomly saying, oh, well, we'll just do that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I didn't adequately sort of present the whole structure of that program, where it's federal flow-through money from the Department of Health and Human Services, and there's a lot, there's intermediaries all along the way, all the way to the youth sitting in the chair. So, yeah, thank you.
Otherwise.
Okay. Margaret.
So, I know your work in CORE was very ground up and encouraged people to think about how to model their own programs and think about how they'd like to evaluate their own programs. And here in this talk, you're encouraging people to think differently about this. But as a practical matter, many of us are grant funded, and we have to work with funders who may not see it that way. Do you have any practical suggestions for changing that?
Yeah, well, I think there's some, and actually getting back to Jane, one thing that Act for Youth has done really well with their good relationship with the Department of Health is educate them. They're always in a dialogical relationship around, you know, how can we do this better? And so, because part of it is educating our funders, which of course there's a power differential there, but it can be done. Actually, I was just reminded by Bill Tosham earlier today that AEA, in addition to writing the statement about methodology, since then has had a policy task force that we think has actually shifted federal policy around what counts as credible evidence. And then another approach is to, and it's more work, but it's to do a kind of both and. Now I'm reminded of Margot Hittleman's work with GIAC, where she did the evaluation work that the stakeholders cared, well, the intended beneficiaries cared about, and then also did the evaluation that the funder cared about. So it's twice the work, but you get to serve both stakeholders, I guess. So those are two potential ways to do it. Yes, Jennifer.
Going back to your mode 1, mode 2 slide.
Yeah.
Because and you talked about how they really weren't polarities.
Right.
And there was interaction
Mm-hmm.
between them. But I think one of the things that we need to be really cautious about is seeing things in terms of polarity.
That's right.
Because this is such a dynamic situation that at the same time as there are these federal mandates saying, choose from these 28 programs, there is also a lot of discourse around practice and alternate forms of evidence. And I guess I'd just be curious about your perspective on, some of the give and take, the dialogue between these modes.
Yeah.
Which really are kind of complementary in some ways rather than,
Yeah. And it's like, I know William T. Grant Foundation is right there in that nexus, and even your work that you guys were trying to get funded about looking at the characteristics of community organizations where this works well, because that's about practices. Everyone has the same program, but it's working some places and not others. So that's also right in the middle, where you can, because we don't want people, educators out there sometimes are saying things to youth which are patently wrong. So that's where science really, really has a place, and that's where an evidence-based program can help. But then, as there are different characteristics about how the adult relates with the youth, what the culture is in that environment. So that's one place also where we can help see this as not a dichotomy. But we need, maybe we should have more evidence-based programs in 4-H, but that are really a constellation of practices. Construed as a we talk about programs in 4-H. It just means a different thing. So yeah, the lines are blurred for sure. Yeah, back there, or either, yeah.
I was wondering, given where you were when you went into this study, where did your own thinking change over the course of doing this and thinking about it?
That's a great question. And it's a great question because I clearly have biases. All research is biased, and it's a matter of knowing about them and sort of working with them. I think I started out more polemical than I ended up, even though I might sound still polemical. And I didn't know anything about the details of it. And I got to talk with people who I knew already, who I'd worked with, and hear them articulate it in ways. This, even though, again, this is not a dichotomy, this was kind of an interesting finding for me because it hadn't quite become that clear to me before. I was like, why is this so why does this feel off to me? Well, but through the interviews and the observation and the documents I got to look at, I got to see sort of why. And so part of it was like how we think about whether it's a program or a practice, how we think about behavior change. And also, some of it was a lot messier than I expected, and which then when I end with my sort of highfalutin theories about science, to me that helps make those theories relevant because I hope, I just don't want to, it helped me look under the hood and see, okay, this is, if this is science-based, then science is a lot messier than we are teaching it to high schoolers to be. So I got to see examples of how that happened. I had suspicions of that, but I changed in that now I have concrete proof of what I thought before. Yeah, great question. Yes.
I really was very interested in the examples you gave about going to Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
Keynesian the program.
Kenyanizing, yeah.
Kenyanizing the program, which is adapt the programs to what they are, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is, and in that area, I think the normative aspect of that process is very important because for us educators is how do you teach sensitivity to other cultures? And it doesn't matter that you have to go to the international arena, you can do it with minorities here in the United States, right? So how do you address this issue? Because in this evidence base that was working at work, we're looking at outcomes, but how we measure the person that carried the program that didn't work with the stereotypes, that didn't, that was more normative.
Yeah, and that's
for me it's a challenge. As educators, what do we do?
Right, and again, that's like in the U.S. There are some people implementing EBPs who should not be working with adolescents or adolescents of a different race or ethnicity or sexual orientation as them, because they just don't have the capabilities to. And those are hard things to train. I mean, it's the same thing as like why we let a chemistry researcher be a chemistry teacher. You know, we sometimes forget that pedagogy and cultural interaction are actual content areas themselves. They're not just fluffy processes. So I don't have a simple answer, but it's whether it's, you know, me implementing a program, you know, downtown, somewhere in downtown Ithaca, or it's a Kenyan, you know, a program from Atlanta being implemented in Kenya. It's a very important questions to ask, and to think about pedagogy and anti-racism as sort of ways of very important, not just sort of tack-ons, but fundamental to whether or not the thing will work well and whether or not the thing will be ethical. We have two Megans over here. Which one wants?
Go ahead. Oh, I wanted to go back a bit to kind of your concrete recommendations. You talked about kind of the more abstract recommendations about how we think about science and education and so forth. But when you were talking about educating funders about the realities of the work that we do as educators, how does that happen?
Yeah, that's
really
hard. That's hard. I mean, so the American Evaluation Association is doing it. They go to Capitol Hill. And actually now, I think they're going to have the conference every 4 years in D.C., so that evaluators, who talk about this all the time, can literally go advocate, sort of anti-advocate to CEBP, Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. But it is hard. I don't know. My other concrete recommendation is really to think about how we as researchers can do more micro types of trials like Campbell was talking about. So that's, and then show that you can do maybe a local trial and get the same outcomes as you would from a multi-million-dollar randomized trial, and then we can show that to the funders, and they'll say, wow, we can save money and be more rapidly responsive to community needs. So.
Well, we're running a little short on time, but maybe one more question.
Okay, Megan.
I'm coming from down the hill, so I'll ask a down the hill question. Do you think that it's possible for researchers to think about the dissemination in a more holistic way of how the dissemination of knowledge and information in our program in a more holistic way when they're building the curriculum? Or do you understand what I'm saying?
I think so, yeah. And there's some, you know, it's one thing I also learned, and I did the study before I was a faculty member, and now I am, so now I have to think about doing research and disseminating it in some way that is holistic and useful. And, you know, a lot of folks I talk to, you know, it has a lot to do with incentive structures and norms and cultures of, like, so I now have to publish journal articles and, you know, doing really, I don't know, different leaders and sort of, because what you're talking about is kind of engaged research, I think, which Richard Kiley just left, but, you know, he's thinking about these questions too. The BCTR is really thinking about that too. And the people in the 4A state office are thinking about that too, and they're not researchers, but they try to work with a lot of researchers. But it's hard if we don't have a Department of Education, so there's not very many people doing research on education. And those who are doing research on youth development want to do like a 80-item survey of the youth, and the only way to get them connected is if you offer up your youth as research subjects. So it's hard, but I think nobody has bad intentions. It's just people operate. That's why I think these theories that I ended with are actually useful, because maybe they can help open up a conversation about not just the structural incentive structures, but the internal identities. John Armstrong, is part of his work, the identity of academics and how that affects how they interact with communities outside of the academic community. So he can answer that better than me, actually.
Wait.
No, he'll stay after to answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tom. This has been very interesting. Thank you.